At 2:17 in the morning, somewhere on a dead stretch of highway in western Texas where there were no houses, no gas stations, no lights, and no sound except wind dragging dust across endless black land, veteran truck driver Daniel Mercer saw a little girl standing barefoot in the middle of the road, and that was terrifying enough on its own. But what made his blood turn cold was the fact that when his headlights hit her face, she was smiling far too wide, her skin looked pale like moonlight, and her eyes reflected no light at all, just two empty black spaces that seemed to swallow the beam from his truck. And in that instant, Daniel slammed both feet on the brakes, so hard his 18-wheeler screamed against the pavement, jackknifing slightly as 40 tons of steel shuddered to a violent stop only yards from where she stood completely motionless in the center lane, wearing a white dress that fluttered in the desert wind while everything around her remained unnaturally still. And Daniel gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white because in 23 years of hauling freight across America, through blizzards in Colorado, storms in Louisiana, mountain passes in Montana, and lonely highways that stretched farther than the eye could see, he had learned one hard truth that truckers rarely say out loud. Some things wait on roads at night, and if you stop for them, you may never leave. But despite every instinct screaming at him to lock his doors and drive straight through, there was something deeply human about seeing a child alone on a road at that hour that made it impossible to ignore. So he leaned forward, heart pounding, and reached for the CB radio microphone with shaking fingers, his voice rough as he called out, "Dispatch, this is Mercer Freight 42. I think I've got a child stranded on Highway 285, mile marker 117, requesting immediate sheriff response." But all that came back through the speaker was thick static followed by a faint crackling whisper that sounded disturbingly close to a voice quietly saying, "Don't let her in." And Daniel froze, staring at the radio, then looked back up at the girl, and she was gone. Not walked away, not running, simply gone from the road in the single second his eyes had left her. And a violent chill shot through his chest as he instinctively checked both side mirrors and saw nothing but darkness, then checked the rearview mirror mounted above, and nearly screamed because standing directly behind his cab doors on the trailer catwalk, gripping the metal railing with unnaturally long fingers, was that same little girl smiling through the back window glass from only inches away, her black eyes fixed on him as one small hand slowly lifted and tapped 3 times against the rear cab window. Knock, knock, knock. And Daniel's entire body went numb with terror, because there was no physical way she could have moved there that fast, no way she could have climbed onto the truck without sound, and no way a human child's smile should stretch almost from ear to ear like that, revealing teeth too narrow and too many, packed tightly together like sharpened needles. And then she mouthed 4 silent words he somehow understood perfectly. "Let me inside," and Daniel reacted on pure survival instinct, slamming the truck into gear and flooring the accelerator as the engine roared like thunder, the cab shaking violently while the massive rig surged forward into the darkness. But in the rearview mirror, she never moved, never blinked, never lost her grip, simply standing on the catwalk smiling, as if riding on the back of speeding 18-wheelers through midnight highways was the most natural thing in the world. And Daniel was breathing so hard his chest burned as he tore down the empty road at nearly 90 miles per hour, hands trembling on the wheel, whispering prayers under his breath, trying not to look in the mirror. But then came a sound that almost made him lose control completely. Giggling, soft childish giggling, from inside the cab behind him, and Daniel slowly turned his head toward the sleeper berth compartment, where darkness filled the small space. And in that darkness, 2 tiny black eyes were open, staring back at him from where no one should have been, followed by the slow shape of a small pale face leaning forward out of shadow, smiling wider than humanly possible. And Daniel screamed, jerking the wheel hard enough that the truck swerved violently across 2 lanes before he barely regained control. But when he looked again, the sleeper berth was empty, only darkness, and he started crying without realizing it. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming horror that something impossible was inside his truck, moving wherever it wanted, appearing wherever it wanted, and he was trapped in a steel box miles from civilization with it. Then his phone rang. through Bluetooth unexpectedly, the screen showing unknown caller, and against every instinct he hit accept, hearing only static for several seconds before an old man's exhausted voice whispered, "If she asks for help, don't answer. If she knocks, don't open. And whatever you do, don't stop driving." Before the call disconnected and Daniel's skin crawled because he had told no one where he was. No one should have known what was happening, and suddenly his dashboard lights flickered once, twice, then went dead completely, leaving only headlights piercing darkness ahead, while every digital gauge blacked out. And over the dead silence of electronics came another sound, a wet breathing directly beside his right ear, like something leaning over his shoulder, and a child's voice softly whispered, "You were supposed to stop." And Daniel whipped his head right and saw her sitting in the passenger seat, buckled in somehow, hands folded neatly in her lap, dress dripping muddy water onto the floor mat, smiling with that impossible mouth while black liquid slowly ran from her empty eyes. And Daniel shouted in pure terror, grabbing the crucifix hanging from his rearview mirror and pressing it toward her. And for the first time her expression changed. The smile twitched, then collapsed into a look of furious hatred so unnatural it barely resembled a face anymore. Her jaw splitting wider and wider until it hung almost at her chest while a sound like hundreds of voices screaming underwater erupted from her throat, shattering the passenger side window outward in an explosion of glass and freezing air. And the truck began violently shaking as if giant hands were slamming against both sides. Invisible force pounding metal hard enough to dent the doors inward, while Daniel fought desperately to keep control. Then in the headlights ahead, he saw an old roadside diner glowing dimly in the darkness like a lighthouse in hell. And with no other choice, he yanked the wheel toward it, fishtailing into the gravel lot and slamming the brakes. So hard smoke poured from the tires before he threw open the cab door and jumped out, sprinting inside screaming for help. Collapsing on a cracked tile floor beneath flickering fluorescent lights, where three old truckers sitting at the counter turned slowly toward him. Not surprised, not confused, just grim, like men who had seen this before. And the oldest, a gray-bearded man named Frank Holloway, quietly said, "You saw Molly Grace, didn't you?" And Daniel, shaking uncontrollably, nodded as Frank sighed deeply and explained that in 1986 a family crashed on that same highway during a storm. Their little daughter Molly was thrown from the car and wandered the road calling for help. But truck after truck drove past, too afraid to stop in the dark, and by sunrise they found her body torn apart by coyotes. But something worse woke with her grief, something that began appearing to lonely drivers, first as a helpless child, then as whatever horror followed when pity opened the door. And every year more truckers vanished on that highway, without trace. Rigs found abandoned with cab doors hanging open and deep scratches carved into steel from inside. And Daniel sat frozen listening, until suddenly Frank's face changed color, and he slowly pointed behind Daniel toward the diner window, where small wet footprints were appearing one by one across the glass, upside down, walking on the outside ceiling toward the entrance, followed by three soft knocks on the diner door. Knock, knock, knock. And every old trucker in that room went pale as death because one whispered, "She's never followed anyone here before." Then all lights died instantly, plunging the diner into blackness, so complete Daniel couldn't see his own hands. And in that darkness came a chorus of childish giggling from every corner of the room at once, then screaming. Adult men screaming in pure terror. Metal twisting glass, breaking wet footsteps running across ceiling tiles overhead, and Daniel curled under a table praying until sunrise light finally crept through shattered windows. And when silence returned, the diner was empty, completely empty, chairs overturned, walls covered in deep claw marks, pools of black muddy water across the floor, but not a single body left behind and outside. Daniel's truck sat alone in the lot with three words scratched deep into the driver's side door in jagged childlike handwriting. "You stopped for me," and Daniel quit trucking that same day, moved across the country, and never drove highways at night again. But every year on the exact date it happened at exactly 2:17 a.m., his phone rings from an unknown number, and when he finally answered once after years of silence, All he heard was soft giggling followed by a little girl's voice whispering close into the speaker, "I'm still riding with you." And from somewhere in the dark hallway of his house behind him came 3 slow knocks that proved she was telling the truth. At exactly 3:41 in the morning, on a freezing November night deep in the mountains of West Virginia, long-haul truck driver Caleb Dawson heard a terrified man screaming for help over his CB radio. And what made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up wasn't the desperation in the man's voice, or even the sound of violent pounding and shattering glass in the background. It was the fact that Caleb recognized that voice immediately, because it belonged to his best friend Mason Cole, a trucker who had vanished on that exact mountain route 3 years earlier, and whose rig had been found abandoned on Black Ridge Road with the engine still running, the driver's side door hanging open, blood smeared across the steering wheel, and no sign of Mason ever again. Caleb's hands tightened around the wheel, so hard his knuckles turned pale as winter frost while his 18-wheeler climbed the dark, twisting mountain highway, surrounded by endless black forest on both sides. Pine trees standing so tall and packed so tightly that they looked less like woods and more like walls built to keep something trapped inside, and static crackled violently through the CB speaker before Mason's voice came again, breathless and shaking, yelling, "Caleb, don't stop, whatever you do, don't pull over. It's in the trees. It watches the lights. Just keep drive." Before the transmission cut into a burst of screaming static so sharp it made Caleb jerk in his seat, and for several seconds the only sound left was the heavy growl of his diesel engine climbing uphill through thick mountain fog while his heartbeat hammered against his ribs like fists on a locked door. Because Caleb knew there was absolutely no way Mason could be speaking. Mason was officially dead, at least as far as everyone believed, and yet that voice had been perfect. Right down to the slight rasp Mason always had from smoking too much and yelling over truck engines for 20 years, and before Caleb could even process it, a new voice crackled through the radio, old and gravelly, speaking slowly like every word cost effort. "Turn your lights off, driver. If it sees you, it follows you home." And then silence, complete silence, as the radio died entirely, leaving only dead static hiss that sounded strangely like whispering buried beneath white noise, and Caleb stared through the windshield into darkness ahead where the road curved sharply around a cliffside, his headlights cutting weak yellow tunnels through rolling fog that moved unnaturally, twisting low across the pavement almost like something crawling. And then his beams hit something standing on the shoulder of the road. A man in a reflective highway jacket waving both arms desperately, face hidden beneath the brim of a hard hat, looking exactly like a stranded road worker in need of help. And Caleb's foot instinctively eased toward the brake before every warning from moments earlier hit him at once, making his stomach not so hard it hurt. Because there should have been no road crews working that stretch at nearly 4 in the morning, not in weather this cold, not in a place this isolated. And as he drove closer, the man's movements became strange, too stiff, too jerky, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. And then the figure lifted its head into the headlights, revealing no face at all beneath the hard hat. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tight, over bone with a vertical split where a mouth should have been, slowly, opening wider and wider, until it tore nearly in half from forehead to throat, exposing rows of tiny twitching teeth that clicked together like insect legs, and Caleb slammed the accelerator instead of the brakes. Engine roaring as the truck surged past, while that thing turned impossibly fast to keep its split-open mouth pointed toward him. And in the side mirror, Caleb saw it standing motionless in the road, shrinking into darkness, until it suddenly appeared much closer in the mirror. Then closer, then directly behind the trailer, running on all fours with limbs bending backward like broken spider legs, keeping pace effortlessly with 80,000 pounds of speeding steel, and Caleb shouted in raw terror, swerving slightly as his trailer fishtailed on black ice before straightening out, but then came violent pounding from inside the trailer itself. Huge, thunderous slams, shaking the entire cab, as if something massive was throwing itself against the cargo walls from within. And Caleb's mind raced because he was hauling sealed refrigerated meat products from Ohio to Virginia. Cargo loaded and locked hours ago, under company security. No human, or anything, should have been back there, yet with each slam the trailer rocked harder until the rear axle bounced. And through his side mirror, he watched one of the trailer's metal panels bulge outward sharply from something striking it inside with impossible force, followed by deep claw marks carving down steel like paper. And his dashboard lights flickered once, twice. Then every gauge dropped dead at once while the cab temperature plunged so fast his breath fogged in front of him, frost crawling across the inside of the windshield in branching white veins. And from the sleeper berth behind him came a wet sound like heavy breathing through waterlogged lungs, followed by a whisper close enough to touch. "You heard Mason too late." And Caleb whipped around to shine his flashlight into the darkness behind the seats, and nearly blacked out from fear because sitting calmly on the sleeper mattress was Mason Cole, or what looked like him, wearing the same faded denim jacket he'd disappeared in 3 years ago, except his skin hung gray and bloated like something drowned. His neck twisted halfway around unnaturally, and his eyes were missing entirely, replaced by black, empty sockets leaking muddy water down his cheeks while he smiled with cracked blue lips and softly said, "Don't let it stop you," before suddenly screaming at the top of his lungs, "It's on the CAB." And at that exact second the roof above Caleb dented inward with a deafening metallic boom. Then another, then long scraping claws dragged across steel directly over his head, circling like a predator testing a cage, and Caleb fought panic. Flooring the truck around another curve where through fog he spotted an old truck stop glowing faintly on a ridge ahead like salvation. Neon sign buzzing weakly, Black Ridge Rest, and he aimed straight for it while the roof continued buckling under enormous weight. Claw tips punching through metal ceiling in 3 places like hooked knives inches above him, dripping black sludge that smelled like rotten pine sap. And just before he reached the lot, something slammed down onto the hood in front of his windshield. The faceless road worker crouched low like an animal, split mouth opening impossibly wide across its entire torso now. Dozens of tiny white eyes blinking open beneath its skin, and Caleb screamed, jerking the wheel hard enough to send the truck crashing sideways through a guardrail into the gravel lot where it jackknifed violently and came to a smoking stop beneath flickering lights. And he threw open the cab door and ran toward the truck stop entrance without looking back, bursting inside, gasping for breath, only to freeze instantly because the place was full of truckers, maybe 15 of them, sitting perfectly still in booths and at the counter, all silent, all staring directly at him with hollow, exhausted eyes like men who hadn't slept in years. And behind the register stood an old woman with deep lines carved into her face who quietly asked, "Did it see your lights?" And Caleb, shaking uncontrollably, could only nod, and every trucker in the room slowly lowered their heads like hearing a death sentence. Then the old woman explained that Black Ridge Road was cut through sacred forest land decades ago, where settlers vanished under moonless skies. And whatever lived there hated fire, hated noise, but loved light, especially headlights cutting through darkness, because light let it see who was traveling alone, and once it chose a driver, it could mimic voices or faces and follow them anywhere until it finally got invited close enough to feed, and Mason hadn't vanished. He'd come to this same truck stop begging for help, but opened the door when he heard his dead mother knocking outside. And what came in, wearing her voice, took him piece by piece until only a copy remained wandering the mountain calling friends on lonely roads. And before Caleb could speak, every light in the truck stop went out at once, plunging the building into total darkness while something massive slammed against the glass front doors hard enough to spiderweb them instantly, followed by another hit, then another, while dozens of tiny clicking teeth chattered outside in the black, circling the building, scraping walls, crawling over the roof, and then, through the darkness came Mason's voice from right beside Caleb's ear whispering, "It got in before you," followed by screams erupting all around as tables overturned. Wet tearing sounds filled the room, claws skittered across ceiling tiles overhead, and shapes moved in darkness too quickly and with too many limbs to understand. and Caleb dropped behind the counter clutching a tire iron while the old woman shoved her road flare into his hand, shouting, "Fire blinds it. Run when you hear silence." And seconds later, absolute silence crashed down unnaturally. Not even breathing left. So Caleb struck the flare, and red fire exploded bright in his fist, illuminating horror for one impossible instant. The truck stopped empty of people, walls dripping black slime, ceiling covered in upside-down pale, human faces fused into flesh like fruit on vines, all whispering softly at once. And in the center of the room stood Mason, smiling without eyes, while behind him rose something so huge its head pressed into ceiling darkness, made of twisted antlers, shadow, mouths, and hundreds of blinking white eyes buried under bark-like skin. And Caleb ran screaming through the back door in a freezing dawnlight, just as the truck stop collapsed inward with a roar like a beast inhaling. And when police found him wandering the highway hours later, there was no truck stop there at all. Only empty ground, old cracked concrete foundations abandoned since 1978, and his wrecked rig sitting alone with its trailer doors torn open from inside, cargo untouched except for one message carved deep into frozen meat in jagged letters. "We follow the light home," and Caleb never drove nights again, moved to Arizona desert highways where roads stay wide and empty beneath open sky. But every few months, at exactly 3:41 a.m., his CB radio, which he unplugged years ago, crackles alive in his silent house. With Mason's desperate voice screaming, "Caleb, kill the lights. It found your road." And every time that happens, something enormous passes slowly outside his bedroom window, blocking moonlight with the shape of antlers stretching far wider than any deer should ever have. At 1:58 in the morning, on a rain-slick stretch of Interstate 40 cutting through the empty darkness of eastern Oklahoma, veteran truck driver Luke Harrison looked into the small rectangular mirror mounted above his passenger seat and saw a man sleeping in the back of his cab, covered to the chest by Luke's blanket, breathing slowly in the darkness of the sleeper berth like he had been there for hours. And what made cold terror flood through Luke's entire body wasn't just the impossible sight of a stranger inside a locked truck moving 70 miles per hour down a highway with no stops for the last 100 miles, but the fact that as lightning flashed white across the windshield, illuminating the sleeper area for a single heartbeat, Luke recognized the sleeping man instantly from photographs every trucker in 3 states had seen pinned on truck stop bulletin boards over the last year. Missing long-haul driver Nathan Reeves, a 46-year-old father of 2 who vanished somewhere between Amarillo and Little Rock, whose abandoned rig had been found idling on the shoulder with headlights on, trailer doors wide open, and one chilling sentence written in condensation across the inside of his windshield. He picked someone up, and Luke's hands locked around the steering wheel, so hard pain shot through his wrists while his mind desperately tried to explain what he had seen, telling himself exhaustion was playing tricks, road hypnosis, lack of sleep, anything rational. But then, from behind him came the unmistakable soft rustle of bedsheets shifting underweight, followed by a low exhausted sigh from the sleeper berth that did not belong to him. And every hair on Luke's body stood upright at once as a smell filled the cab. Not alcohol, sweat, or wet clothes, but damp earth mixed with something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long on a grave. And without daring to fully turn around, Luke slowly angled the overhead mirror and saw Nathan Reeves now sitting upright in the sleeper berth, staring directly at him with hollow pale eyes ringed in dark bruised skin, lips cracked blue from cold, rainwater dripping steadily from his hair onto Luke's mattress even though the inside of the cab was dry. And Nathan spoke in a weak, trembling voice barely louder than a whisper. "Don't stop for the woman in white. She isn't alone." Before suddenly, grabbing the sides of his own head and screaming in raw terror, "She's under the CAB." And at that exact moment, something massive slammed violently upward into the floor beneath Luke's feet hard enough to lift him off the seat. The whole 18-wheeler shuddering as metal groaned under impossible force from below, followed by long scraping sounds racing beneath the truck from rear axle to front bumper like giant claws dragging across steel. And Luke shouted in panic, fighting to keep control. As rain hammered the windshield and wipers struggled uselessly against sheets of water. But through the storm, he suddenly saw a figure standing perfectly still in the middle lane ahead. A woman in a long white dress, barefoot, soaking wet, head hanging unnaturally low, so black hair covered her face. And Luke's chest tightened because there was nowhere she could have come from. No car, no shoulder access, no lights for miles. Just that impossible, still figure waiting in darkness and remembering. Nathan's warning. Luke jerked the wheel to avoid her without braking. The truck roaring past, so close rain from the tires whipped her dress violently sideways. And as her face snapped upward toward his driver window, lightning illuminated skin stretched too tight over bone. A mouth split far too wide into a smile full of tiny sharp teeth, and empty black eye sockets crawling with writhing pale worms, and Luke nearly lost control, screaming. But in his side mirror, he saw something even worse. When he passed her, she didn't shrink into distance. She was now running beside the trailer effortlessly at highway speed, bare feet slapping pavement, head twisted sideways unnaturally to grin up at him, while dozens of pale, human arms slowly unfolded from beneath her dress like spider legs, gripping the side of the trailer and climbing upward. And from behind Luke came Nathan Reeves' broken voice whispering, "She found another ride," followed by the wet cracking sound of bones snapping into wrong positions. And when Luke looked in the mirror again, Nathan was standing on all fours in the sleeper berth like an animal, neck bent backward so his upside-down face stared at Luke, mouth hanging open far beyond human limits while muddy water poured endlessly from his throat. In a voice layered with many whispering voices, he said, "We only hitchhike were invited," before launching forward, but vanished halfway into darkness. And instantly 2 icy hands wrapped around Luke's throat from the back seat, squeezing hard enough to crush breath from him, while ghostly whispering voices filled the cab from every direction. "Let us ride, let us ride, let us ride." And Luke clawed desperately at invisible fingers while steering one-handed through storm and terror, vision narrowing, until ahead through rain he saw the glowing red sign of a 24-hour truck plaza, salvation burning in darkness like a lighthouse. And with his last strength, he blasted the air horn continuously, a deafening roar that shook windows. And the unseen hands released instantly, recoiling with shrill, inhuman shrieks that pierced his ears like knives. Because whatever held him hated loud, iron thunder, and Luke fishtailed violently into the truck plaza lot, crashing through orange cones and slamming sideways between parked rigs before stumbling out in a pouring rain, gasping for air. Sprinting inside the brightly lit diner attached to the station where a dozen tired truckers looked up, and every face went pale the moment they saw what was standing behind him outside the glass doors. The woman in white, smiling unnaturally in rain, surrounded by shadowy human figures gathering in darkness behind her one by one, each soaking wet, each standing perfectly still, dozens of them. Then more emerging between parked trucks like a silent crowd of drowned hitchhikers watching the diner. With hollow patience. And an old driver named Earl Maddox quietly stood, locked the front doors, shut every blind, and said in a shaking voice, he brought the riders. Then told Luke about a forgotten church bus crash in 1964 where 27 people drowned in floodwater beneath a collapsed bridge near that highway, bodies trapped underwater for weeks before recovery. And since then, lonely roads filled with rain became their hunting ground, appearing as stranded travelers needing help. But any driver who acknowledged them, stopped, waved, flashed lights, even looked too long, gave an invitation to climb aboard. First one. Then many, each ride ending with the driver vanishing and their empty rig found running with wet footprints inside and sleeper blankets soaked in muddy river water, and Luke sat trembling until suddenly every light in the diner flickered, then dimmed, and from the ceiling above came slow dripping. Not water, but dark muddy liquid splashing onto tables, followed by soft footsteps walking overhead where no floor existed, then scratching inside the walls, then knocking beneath the tile floor, Dozens of knocks all at once, like many hands wanting out, and one by one truck horns outside began blaring on their own in long, desperate screams, while shadowy wet handprints slid down covered windows. And then from the diner bathroom hallway came a familiar voice calling weakly, "Luke, help me, Nathan Reeves," sounding human again, terrified and crying, begging, "Please don't leave me with them." And before anyone could stop him, Luke took one step toward that voice, just one. And instantly every old trucker shouted a no, but too late because the hallway darkness swelled outward unnaturally like floodwater rising uphill, and pale arms burst from walls, floor, and ceiling, hundreds of grasping hands slick with mud reaching, clawing, dragging screaming men into darkness while wet bodies crawled across ceilings like insects, mouths opening impossibly wide, whispering, ride with us," and chaos exploded as Earl shoved Luke through the kitchen exit yelling, "Run before sunrise is theirs," and Luke fled into storm, hiding beneath a fuel tanker until dawn finally broke gray across the sky and silence fell all at once, unnatural and heavy. And when police arrived, there was no diner damage, no bodies, no muddy footprints, nothing at all, except every parked truck in the plaza stood empty with engines idling. Drivers vanished without trace, and on Luke's mattress inside his cab, police found dozens of soaking wet handprints and one sentence pressed deep in the blanket as though written by fingers from beneath the fabric. "Thank you for the ride." And Luke never drove again, sold everything, moved inland far from rivers and highways. But every time heavy rain falls after midnight, he wakes to hear slow footsteps pacing inside his house hallway. Wet footprints appearing across dry wooden floors toward his bedroom. And if he looks beneath his bed, muddy water is already dripping from the frame, along with pale fingers slowly curling over the edge, waiting patiently for him to invite them on one last ride.